Nora?
Welcome, queridas comadres and friends. So lovely to see so many of you. I hope I get to see you in person soon. I'm Nora de Hoyos Comstock, national and international founder of Las Comadres para las Americas. The leadership team and I are so happy to have you join us for tonight's teleconference as we celebrate our book club's quinceañero. It's been our privilege to support Latino authors throughout these many years, and we look forward to the next 15. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to readers following us on our live Twitter chat. Tonight, please help us welcome authors Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa and Alejandro Varela. Their interviews will begin shortly. But before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Keep yourselves on mute. And you can keep your videos on if you like. And at the same time, you can put it on speaker mode so that you can see the speaker big. Or you can stay on gallery and get to see all of us. Whatever you want. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them. Oops, hold on a minute. And so first, let's start with our book club's history. Comadre Maria.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Maria Ferrer, project manager for Las Comadres para las Americas. Our first book club gathering was in July 2004 in New York. After a hiatus, Nora Comstock re-envisioned and relaunched the book club nationwide to promote the work of Latino authors to every book lover, to bring our community to bookstores, and to support our writers. We started these teleconferences in October 2006. We are in our 15th year. Happy quinceañero. Yeah. We are in 15th year of sharing works by Latino authors with all of you. We created the teleconferences and the book club to entice everyone to read more Latino authors, to learn about Latino roots and different perspectives on Latino culture and heritage. Our book club and teleconferences are open to all, not just Latinos. We are creating a space for everyone to explore the Latino writer's mind and soul as portrayed through the written word. We encourage you to join a local book club in your city or in your time zone. We have 12 clubs in different cities that are meeting right now virtually. There is sure to be one that can fit your schedule. If your city doesn't have one, help us start one. For more information about the book club, please visit our website on www.latinolit.com. Please invite others to join with you as well. Comadre Karen.
Welcome, comadres and friends, to our July 2022 Zoom teleconference. I'm Karen Gonzalez, Assistant Coordinator for the Las Comadres and Friends Book Club, Denver Comadres Book Club Facilitator, and co-founder of the Colorado Alliance of Latino Mentors and Authors. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight we begin with our interview with author Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa, who was born in Puerto Rico and raised in New York City. As a child, she was sent to live with her grandparents in Puerto Rico, where she was introduced to the culture of rural Puerto Rico, including the storytelling that came naturally to the women in her family, especially the older women. Much of her work is based on her experiences during this time. The hardcover edition of her first novel, Daughters of the Stone, was listed as a 2010 finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her recent novel, A Woman of Endurance, set in 19th century Puerto Rican plantation society, is also available in the Spanish language edition, Indomita. Interviewing her is Comadre Clara Galvano. Clara is an independent freelance writer. She was recognized last year by the Comité Noviembre with their Lo Mejor de Nuestra Comunidad award. Clara is also a longtime member of the Las Comadres New York City network. Comadre Clara, take it away.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor for me to be able to be with everyone here and to especially to be able to interview my friend Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa. Dahlma, those of us who read your first book were anxiously awaiting your second. Why did it take more than 10 years to get A Woman of Endurance into our hands?
That's a great question. That's like asking somebody, why didn't you go to Harvard? Um, it's not so much what you want as much as what the industry needs and is interested in focusing on. So I finished the novel years before I actually sold the novel. And so it was actually published this year, but I was done with it about 5 or 6 years ago.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. How did you engage in your research? Were there any libraries or any old timers that helped you significantly?
As a librarian, I loved traditional research techniques. So I did go to libraries, specialized libraries. So I used the Center for Puerto Rican Studies here in New York at Hunter College. And I also used the Biblioteca Nacional in San Juan. And then I started talking to the oldest people I could find in Puerto Rico. And they were all more than happy to share stories about their youth. They were so happy that anybody was interested in what happened to them as children and to their parents and their grandparents, because their grandparents were born in 19th century Puerto Rico. So that was my favorite kind of research. But I also talked to scholars at the university, architects, archaeologists, and people who were guides and leaders in restored plantations and plantation ruins in Puerto Rico. So I did a lot of going through forests and getting through trees and climbing over fences to see the ruins of plantations that were still there.
Wow, that is really amazing. You know, slavery is not an easy topic to discuss or to write about. Was writing this book more draining than Daughters of the Stone?
It was more draining, mostly because Daughters of the Stone was a novel about 5 generations. So I was really focusing on the story itself. But this novel is about one character in particular. And I really went deeply into this one character and her reaction to what was happening to her. And what was happening to her, as in every enslavement story, was brutal and violent at times. And I know that that's hard for people to read sometimes. So I tried very hard not to sensationalize it. But in order to understand her journey to healing, you have to see where she started from. And so there is some violence and some brutality in the book, but I just ask my readers to trust that I will not leave them in the dark.
Thank you. Thank you.
Going through to the light.
Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. You know, Woman of Endurance, Paula slowly becomes part of our Caribbean community, drawn by the music and the food. Her endurance and her resilience are admirable. Where did this woman come from? Who or what inspired her for you?
In terms of where did this woman come from, the character was originally introduced in Daughters of the Stone, the first book. And she was a really angry character. And she was really feisty and argumentative and confrontative. And I decided I wanted to, what made her that way, right? And so when I started thinking about the lives of enslaved women, they have many reasons to be angry and combative and confrontative. And I wanted to see what would happen in her life. And I also felt that I had my grandmother and other older women in Puerto Rico who, although they had very different lives, had many of the same challenges in terms of living within a structure in which economic and physical power was in the hands of someone else. So if that's the case, what kind of power do we have? And how do we yield that power? because I never believed the myth that Puerto Rican women are timid and subservient. I have not seen any timid or subservient women in my family. In fact, some of them are pretty scary when you get them angry. So I wanted to break that stereotype. So those are some of the reasons.
I understand. Thank you. Well, in Puerto Rico, there are families of Middle Eastern descent, many of whom retain their Muslim heritage. I know some of these, so for generations, but the white perception is that these communities arrived as merchants. Simón is the very first depiction I have seen of an enslaved Muslim from Africa in Puerto Rico. How does Simón's character come about, and were there accounts of Muslim slaves you relied upon for inspiration? P.S. Does he have a modern day brother? Asking for a friend.
A lot of my female friends have asked me if Simón has a brother. I did not research that aspect of Puerto Rican society, but I did know that I wanted my writer lens to be just on the enslaved community. And in many novels, the white characters are the center and we end up being secondary. I wanted to write a novel in which we were primary and the white characters are secondary. They may have had a lot of power. However, the enslaved community must have had a tremendous emotional and psychological power because we're here. And in spite of all that has happened historically, we are still here and still thriving. So what accounts for that? What kind of power did we have? So for me, looking at a diverse enslaved community was really important because they tell us slaves came from all different parts of Africa because the slave catchers wanted to mix them up so that they couldn't communicate with each other. So I wanted to have as wide a community as possible. So there's a Muslim scholar, there are collaborators, there are self-haters, there are protectors, there are curanderas, there are artisans, there are all kinds of people within that community. So this book probably has 20 or 30 characters in it.
Okay. Las Agujas is a distinct entity. Hold on a second. Give me a minute. I was really excited about Las Agujas because, my family has always done needlework. And when I started reading about this, it was really interesting to me. How did you learn of the secondary businesses that could bring funds to the plantations? Were these embroidery sewing communities part of one particular plantation that you researched? Or was this something more widespread and many plantations had beadwork or handiwork under the purview? Even Simón ends up having a cane and wood workshop. Did the slaves come with fine skills that the owners exploited? And European, I can't say it, from Europe.
Yes. A lot of people think that Africa is a barren land, but Africa had its own art and many different forms of art. If you look at African textiles and fabrics, you know that there were people who were artisans at this. So no, Europe did not invent our needlecrafts. We had costureras, we had people who did mundillo, we had people who did lace, and all of that is still in Puerto Rico. It's still passed down. Mm-hmm. And when you read about the migration to New York City of Puerto Ricans in the 1950s, a lot of those women were brought here and worked in the Ladies Garment Workers Union, and they created a very strong union between them and the Jewish tailors. They kept the rest of us clothed until the 1970s or 80s. So I think that tradition of Las Agujas has been with us for centuries.
My mom worked in that field, so I know exactly what you're speaking about. Mm-hmm. So a pregnant Pola was tied over 4 posts so she could be beaten and punished. but with an opening for her belly so that the baby was not harmed and could still be sold off. There were probably many worse ways to punish runaways, but the torture by partial burial with honey to attract insects that would finish off the couple that tried to escape opened my eyes to the cruelty of the plantation owners beyond the whippings, beatings, and rapes that we've been told about more generally. Were these other practices recounted as common in your research or as something that stood out as a particularly infamous haciendas?
I looked at a lot of different forms of what some people call discipline and I call torture, right? I did not want to overload the reader with really gruesome details. I didn't want a blood and guts kind of novel where you had to put it down because it turned your stomach. I think it's already a strong enough novel as it is, but I wanted to show a different kind of brutality. And even though by comparison, these slave owners were less brutal than, for instance, the ones in her first plantation, there is no such thing as a benevolent slave owner. You can't be kind and own another person. By definition, you have to restrain them in order to keep them. And so I wanted to show that Don Tomás, as much as he wanted to think of himself as a good patron, there's no such thing as a good patron, because if they run away, you are going to take measures to stop that. And that particular kind of torture, I found out from a friend whose great-grandfather told her that this is what his father did on his plantation, because he didn't want to damage the goods, that is the baby that was still in utero.
Unbelievable. That is unbelievable. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. A little lighter right now. Yemaya's description was absolutely so beautiful. Her crown with the stars and seahorses, etc., made me smile. Her wisdom when she asked Paula, well, you asked me for help, but have you paid any attention to the blessings around you that I have already sent? Many Puerto Ricans and others pray not only to their Western traditional religious figures, Catholicism, wherever, but also hold their African Orisha figures with respect. Yemaya, Queen of the Ocean, was Paula's religious lifeline, which throughout the book she either denied or celebrated. Why did you pick Yemaya as your spiritual figure of devotion?
Yemaya is the goddess of the ocean, but she is also the goddess of motherhood and of femininity and fertility. And for Paula, those are three big issues. And so I picked her for that reason. But for every novel that I write, there will be a different Yemaya, a different Orisha. Okay. So for Daughters of the Stone, it was Oshun, who is the goddess of sexuality and the home and the attraction between men and women. For the third book, it will be Osain, who is the god of the forest. And I think that there is a lot in the Yoruba religion that got those slaves through their lives.
Oh, yeah.
And people don't want to talk about it in today's world. Everybody is Católico y Apostólico, and they all believe in the Papa. But, so many people have un altar in the back room, and that was done out of necessity. They couldn't worship their gods openly. So they had this parallel structure. So Yemaya is La Caridad del Cobre in Cuba and is the Virgin Mary. So you will see that the color schemes and the symbols for Yemaya are also important within the Catholic faith.
She was just really beautiful. I loved it. Thank you for that.
In terms of research, what I did was I researched images of Yemaya from all over, and I created one that melded together a lot of the images that I found.
That felt good for you. I understand totally. well, you know, one of my favorite characters, Rufina.
Mhm.
Rufina's herbs could heal, but she also used them to take Celestina out. She lost her hair and her albino condition. I wanted to know what happened, whether one of the Denver Comadres submitted a question asking if there were indeed herbs that can save, can have that effect. Also, was it common for the haciendas to rely on enslaved curanderas for the medical needs of so many people on the hacienda, or was it just for the slaves?
I'll start with the second question.
Okay.
The owners would not call a white doctor in from San Juan or wherever to tend to a slave. So the curandera took care of the slave community, the enslaved community. And of course, she used natural herbs to do so. There were curanderas probably in every plantation, although I did not find that specific reference. But there are still curanderas, and there will probably always be curanderas. And it's not just a Puerto Rican construct. There are curanderas all over Latin America, in Mexico, in Cuba, in DR. So it was a necessity during the 19th century, and still people go to curanderas, especially when they don't trust Western doctors.
Mhm.
And now that so many doctors have left Puerto Rico because after Maria, they can't make a living there, curanderas are even more necessary because sometimes you can't get an appointment with a doctor for 2 months.
Mhm.
So somebody's got to deal with it. And by the way, the question, are there real herbs that can do such a thing? Somebody else asked me that. I don't know, and I don't want to know.
Okay, so let's leave that one alone.
Let's leave it alone.
Now, Leticia La Loca. How did
My favorite, yes.
Oh my gosh, she was great. How did you learn that a slave community could ostracize someone like her, who started out as one of their own, but became a traitor from within?
Now think about this. Every enslaved person is the property of the owner. So no matter how angry they might have been with her, they could not harm her openly because they would then be disciplined for having damaged property of the slave owners, right? So what they did was withdraw community, which is really important during slavery times, because the only people you could depend on were other slaves.
Yeah.
So if everybody withdrew their support, you were basically on your own, and surviving on your own under those conditions was really more than most people could bear.
Mm.
And I also think it's a measure of the sophistication of the community that realized that by isolating her, they were expressing their displeasure, their distrust, their anger towards her much more effectively than if somebody had beaten her. This was a serious way of dealing with the problem.
Very serious, it's true. I'm going to go into Chachita. You know, when I was reading it, I knew what she had, because I read about it before in Puerto Rico. She had leprosy, but Rufina knew there was nothing she could do for her. Was leprosy something that occurred in Puerto Rico's plantations? Was this Paula's baby girl who had been sold off previously and unwittingly reunited with her on another child to fill the void Paula felt as a mother?
Leprosy, or what's now referred to as Hansen's disease,
Hmm.
did exist in Puerto Rico. It existed until the 1950s. And then the United States moved all the people, all the patients out of Puerto Rico and into Louisiana. And that, it was really an experimental station to figure out what to do about Hansen's disease. And so they just moved all these people there.
Ah,
And it's really an amazing story because there those patients created their own newspapers, their own baseball teams, their own beauty contests. They recreated Puerto Rico in Louisiana.
that's amazing. I didn't know that.
They did, and one day when I get to Louisiana, I'm going to go to their cemetery because their cemetery is still there with
Oh.
their names and their dates, because they never got to go back to Puerto Rico. They're still there.
Wow. My goodness
Um,
gracious.
So, so now I lost my chain of thought. Oh, did they have the leprosy in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
I know of 2 leper colonies, one in San Juan, in what is Isla Mujeres today. I mean, I'm sorry, not Isla de Cabra. And they put them there because it's an island off the coast of San Juan, so they could isolate them and not have them infect the rest of the population, which is what they were all afraid of.
Mhm.
But before that, they were kept in a jail in Carolina. So there were all kinds of attempts to isolate them. And as you can see from the book, there was also an attempt to isolate Chachita. So as a child,
Mhm.
she was left in the forest on her own
Yes.
to survive if she could or not. So
Oh, amazing. It was amazing. I knew there was a history, and I'm glad that you brought it into the book, and took her out the way that she had to. And I love those 2 little boys, Dahlma. I think they were Paula's babies. They appeared when she needed them the most, and when she finally married Simon, their work was done and they left for good. Was that your inspiration to make them part of her story?
I am going to let the reader decide who these ghost children are or are not, but they were definitely a protective force.
Okay.
In terms of Catholicism, people can think of them as guardian angels.
Mhm.
In terms of Espiritismo, they could think of them as guides. In terms of psychology, you could think of them as psychological constructs that allowed her to go on her healing voyage. But whatever you think they are, whatever mysticism you may or may not attract to them, they served a very important function in her life. And most people don't even realize that they are there from chapter 1 to the end of the book.
Oh my God. It was a wonderful book. My last question actually is, you concentrate your writing on Afro-Latinas. Do you find that Afro-Latinos are not being given proper representation in literature even today?
Absolutely, they are not. We are not. We didn't even have the term Afro-Latino until maybe 10 years ago. So everybody was saying, well, we're the 3 races and all that. And there's no racism in Puerto Rico. Well, we all know that's not true. Puerto Ricans, like every other group of people in the world, have their own prejudices. And the story of Afro-Puerto Ricanos has not been told. And now there's a very strong movement that insists on being recognized. And I write because we have been voiceless and faceless for too long. And so my mission is to insist that we have a face not only in Puerto Rico, but in the United States, and not only in sports, but in all walks of life. So that's what I do.
Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa, you just fill us with pride. We are so honored to have you here, and thank you so much for sharing with everyone. We love you.
Thank you. I wish I had time in the beginning to say, I have been a comadre for a long time. And Comadres de las Americas has always been incredibly supportive through my first book, through this book, even though through the pandemic in particular, we have all been isolated. I can feel the comadres there. And I always put you on high because that's where you belong. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, gracias, comadres. Our second interview is with Alejandro Varela. Alejandro is based in New York. His work has appeared in various literary magazines, including The Point Magazine, Boston Review, Harper's Magazine, The Rumpus, The Brooklyn Rail, Pariahs, an anthology, SFA Press 2016, the Southampton Review, and the New Republic. He is a 2019 Jerome Fellow in Literature, and his graduate studies were in public health. Interviewing Alejandro is Maria Ferrar. Maria is the director of programs for Las Comadres para las Americas. She is a meeting planner, a reader, and a Jill of all trades. She is a longtime member of the Las Comadres New York City network. Take it away, Maria.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. Welcome, Alejandro.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So I have your book right here. The Town of Babylon by Alejandro Varela. I love the cover, by the way. It is so pink and shiny. For those who have not finished reading the book, or have it like on their to be read pile, give us a general synopsis of what the book is about and what they're missing if they don't read it.
Okay. Happy to. So can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Great. So Town of Babylon is the main sort of character there is Andres, and he's a public health professor who returns to the suburban hometown where he grew up to take care of his father, who's recovering from surgery. Both of his parents are alive, and he sort of uses the cover of a rocky marriage to get away from the city. Sure, he wants to be there for his parents, but he's also escaping a bit. And while he's there, it happens to coincide with the 20th anniversary of his high school graduation. And he hasn't seen anyone in 20 years, none of those people from his life. So he, on a whim, maybe a bit of desperation, trying to get away from his family, he goes to the reunion and reconnects with several people, including his first love, Jeremy, who is married with children, and they begin an affair in the book. He connects with several other friends, including a homophobic pastor who may or may not have been responsible for a hate crime in their youth. And there's Simone, his best friend from high school, who is dealing with schizophrenia and is in a psychiatric hospital. And so he rekindles all of these relationships, and in the process deals with the death of his brother, Henry, who died, before the book takes place. And so he sort of remembers him. And the book jumps back and forth in time and also between narrators, Andres and then an omniscient narrator who gives a history of the town and a bit of a history of the United States as well, and sort of all of the motivations and reasons why this town came to be.
Very good. Let's start with the title of the book. Okay, we've had a couple of our book clubs send in the same question about the title of the book, The Town of Babylon. I know that you were writing specifically about Babylon in Long Island in New York, where my aunt actually and all my cousins still live. And but one of the big things about Babylon is also the biblical Babylon, which it's like another one of those Sodom and Gomorrah things. So did that image, did that cross your mind too?
Certainly. In fact, I would say that is the primary reference. The reference to Babylon was in my mind biblical, in part because the characters in the town are a Catholic town. So I wanted to refer to some of the stories that I remember as a kid. But this idea of Babylon, I imagined a town being populated by people who share sort of geographical space, but who don't truly commune with one another. Sort of one human race speaking one language, but because of greed and aspirations are sort of punished by their God. So that's the story that I remember. And then I thought of this town and the ways in which all of these different groups came together, and instead of uniting and forming one community, there are all these differences that become barriers, right? And so that was the sort of thought I had of the town of Babylon. That it also, in the sort of Rastafarian tradition, refers to sort of Babylon as a capitalist construct that's sort of instrumental in the oppression of humanity, I think fits nicely with the idea of the suburbs and how they've been used to segregate and to promote economic achievement unevenly. And I'm referring specifically to the history of this town and many suburbs who where the government sort of gave loans to white families and didn't to brown and black families, and so managed to keep the suburbs segregated. So that was definitely sort of on my mind as well. And it's true. I grew up in a small town called Deer Park. It's an unincorporated village on the south shore of Long Island. And that is within the township of Babylon. Now, I thought this would be my little secret that no one would know. And that a few
Please, it's on
friends,
exit 51.
exactly. And but the moment I sold the book, even my editor, when he did the sort of announcement, I think it appears in Publishers Weekly, or I don't remember, it's in a trade journal, that they'll say this book was sold to so-and-so, and he described it as a story about a suburban town in Long Island. I immediately emailed him. I said, "How dare you?" I did not. But it's fine, and I think most people do associate it with Long Island. But and I draw on that for sure. I draw on my experiences, and when I finished writing the book, I took a trip back to visit and sort of tried to see what I remembered and what it actually looked like and whether it lined up a bit. I think I did all right.
And so tell us about your writing process. Did you start with the characters? Did you start with the town? And how long did it take you to write? And did you know that you were going to have so many characters?
So I started with the town itself, and I wasn't actually thinking of any of the things that we talked about just now. That was the inspiration for the name, but the inspiration for the town and the people was a place called Roseto, Pennsylvania. And Roseto, for those of you who don't know, is about 75 miles west of New York City. And that town is important to me because it was part of my public health education. As you said in the introduction, my background is in public health. I was doing cancer research and HIV/AIDS work before I turned to writing fiction. And Roseto is interesting because in the late 19th century, Italian immigrants moved there and sort of populated this area that became Roseto, and it was named after the town that they were from in Italy. And most of the Italians did manual labor in the slate quarries that were owned by the Welsh and the English, who mistreated them horribly, which is also part of the American tradition. Everyone who arrives is mistreated by the people who were mistreated before. And they, over time, became a very, very tight-knit community. 3 and 4 generations living in each home. Everyone on the block knew each other. It's as if they had the same trajectory, the same immigrant trajectory, the same socioeconomic trajectory. And so there was very, very little difference between them. Sure, there was a gradient of class, but for the most part, they were all in the same boat. And by the 1950s, they had sort of this inexplicably great health. They were healthier than the rest of the United States. They had half the heart disease rate, and heart disease then as now is the leading killer in the United States. They had very low, almost no crime. And 2 doctors were talking about this. One of the doctors that worked in that town was meeting with his friend, Stuart Wolf, who's a researcher who I believe at the time was in Oklahoma. And he said, "I have no patients." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No one has heart attacks where I work in this town." He said, "You wouldn't believe it." And so he said, I have to see this. So he went to the town, and with a team of researchers, and they interviewed everyone. They looked at the entire history, and they thought it must be the Mediterranean diet. They thought it must be the water. People always think when someone's healthy, it must be the water. The water in that place must be very good. And it wasn't, because the neighboring towns shared the same water system and the same hospital system, and they had twice the rate of heart disease. So it had nothing to do with those things. And what they determined after having interviewed everyone, by the way, they weren't just 3 and 4 generations and there wasn't any crime. They were more overweight than the average American. They drank more wine than the average American. They had more fat in their diet than the average American. They put lard in every meal. They smoked unfiltered cigarettes. Essentially what the Surgeon General was telling all of the United States not to do, they did it. But what they had that most of the United States didn't have, was a sense of community, a very strong sense of community that has since in public health become known as the Roseto effect. And that Roseto effect says that if you feel a bond where you live and where you are, if you feel safe and supported, it becomes such a buffer that it almost doesn't matter what happens outside of that bubble, because the rest will sort of really, it'll balance the amount of cortisol that you're dealing with on a daily basis. So they were being mistreated in the mines. Eventually they had their own politicians and their own organizations and their own businesses, but for a long time they were being mistreated, and yet they still manage. And we see this effect in other communities all the time. We do, but it was studied there, and they were outliving everyone. Their life expectancy was higher than the average. And the researchers predicted rightfully that in 20 years they would come back and they would have caught up to the average. And it was true. They came back, and most of the men had zippers on their chests from open heart surgery. And what had happened was that the third and fourth generation said, "No, we're out of here. You're in my business. I want a bigger house. I want more space. I want to live in the city. Essentially, I want to do all the things that you escaped, right? And I want to live the American dream." So that's where I wanted to write about that town. I wanted to continue my public health work. I thought this story is too important. People need to know this. And so I wanted to write about that town. And then I got to thinking about the town that I grew up in, this working class, Irish, Italian, Catholic community. And I thought, but this was not a healthy place. So then I thought, this was Roseto after the third and fourth generations left. And I showed up and then started to see, I lived through the after effects, after they'd caught up. So then I imagined those people. And then I turned to the characters, and I thought, community is a buffer. Isolation has the opposite effect. If you feel alone. So then I focused on 3 or 5 characters who were all in some way alone. They were isolated or marginalized, or they didn't have a community of their own. And then I followed their lives to show that it has negative effects, but it has negative effects on everyone, right? Not just the people who arrived to the town, but the people from Roseto in the real life example. Their health suffered because of the people who left, and possibly because of the barriers and the differences that happened when the new people came in. So that was the inspiration for all of this. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
Yes. As you were talking, I kept remembering 100 Years of Solitude.
Mm.
You know that book, right?
Yes.
Where the whole town is basically, they're all doing well. They're all growing at their own pace. They are basically in a paradise. And then in 100 years, when they get discovered and when the jungle opens up, it's like they're all destroyed. It's like a totally, the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah.
But talking about mental health, public health, which is what you studied, like you were saying, you concentrated on 5 characters and stuff, and you basically gave them all sicknesses. You have schizophrenia, and then the other one has heart issues, diabetes, people phobia, obsessions. I mean, you went all out. So that is also, you wrote that purposely, included all those health issues to show that the as you were saying, the community aspect is important.
Right. I would say that's the only part that's not fiction in this book, which is to say that is, to me, the America that I know, the United States that I know, which is a lack of community, differences used as barriers as opposed to bridges, and then the resulting poor health that happens in a sort of capitalist society that prioritizes money making as opposed to health and safety and happiness. And it isn't a far cry from, the number of people in my family with diabetes, the number of people in my geographic community now where I live with diabetes, the number of people with mental health issues in my life, in my family, in my community. And, someone at some point was talking to me about, and I consider violence a public health issue as well. And so the character who has this history of the attack, the pastor, someone was telling me, and my editor and I talked about this, he said, "Are you sure you want to include a murder mystery subplot?" It's a genre jump. It's a shift from what the rest of this is. And I thought, to me, it's not a change in genre. That's real life. I sort of grew up with that violence around me, and that degree of kind of toxic, to use the words of the day, that sort of toxic masculinity and misogyny that contributes to homophobia. And so I thought, this is the whole picture. This is the real thing. You know, this happens in towns that are struggling, in places where you know, jobs disappear, and people have to sort of compete for resources and see each other as threats. And yeah, so to me, focusing on those health issues really was about painting an accurate picture of a struggling corner of the United States, of the American experience.
Did you also, because one of the things that I also saw in the book and in the characters, you know, universal themes. You know, there's definitely, you know, the love of family, the drama of family, you know, infidelity, you have the discrimination, faith, you know, religious faith and faith in your fellow man. Then at the end, you know, you do have redemption, and it was a little weird about Paul wanting to pray for him, but you know, so you gave them all sicknesses, illnesses. Did you also, you know, did these universal themes also work, you know, subconsciously as you were writing, and so you gifted them equally?
I mean, yes, all of these themes are sort of always swirling around in my head, but the idea that I really wanted to drive home was that the cure is community. The cure is always social support. And I don't mean that in a woo-woo sort of way, you know, but maybe I do a little, but I mean that in a very scientific sort of way. We could measure the amount of cortisol and stress in our bodies. That's scientific. I can do that with a strip of paper and, you know, swab the inside of your cheek, and we can keep track of how those levels of stress change in your life every day. And a little bit is okay. You know, if you're about to have a baby or a presentation, I was a little nervous before this, you know, there's a spike in my cortisol, right? But if you're living with it all day long, if you can't make eye contact with your neighbors because you don't trust them, or you're afraid they don't trust you, or you're bitter because they may not trust you, or because they just moved here and you've been here longer, and all of these things all day long, they increase the wear and tear in your body. That's what cortisol does. So instead of having a sort of a moment, you know, of energy or burst of energy, it's all day long, and it sort of speeds up, the end, which is why life expectancy in the United States is what it is relative to other wealthy nations. We should have the highest, the amount we spend on healthcare, the amount we produce, the history that we have. And so I really wanted to, so anyway, it's easy for that to happen when we're all so separated by all of our hierarchies, not just economic, but racial and gender and ability, and you name it. And so community is the answer. Is how do we flatten this hierarchy in a way that brings us together? I can't hold your hand if you're way up there, and you can't hold my hand if you're way down there. It's logistically impossible. And so I wanted to talk about all of those things. And sometimes it comes through family, and sometimes it comes through neighborhood, and sometimes it comes through church. And there are many ways for us to have community, but I thought it was that those were the ideas that I wanted to bring to the table.
Yeah, no, and you do, because, you know, you start with, because let's face it, Andres is separated from his family, you know, and he only comes home because his father's sick and his mom needs help, because his mom, you know, as you learn later on, I mean, she doesn't want to, you know, she's always felt that the whole town has been watching her, and they hate her. So she has been, you know, she has made herself a pariah, you know, nobody wants to hang out with her, and she has never stepped forward. So, you know, she hasn't been like the best role model, because Andres also, you know, is not connecting with the family. Yeah. But to me, you know, like this whole book, you know, the men were really key. The men were up front and center on the whole stage. But to me, one of the key people who is totally never really in the story, he's sort of like, you know, the brother, Henry. He's dead before it all happens. You know, he's dead before Andres goes home. He's dead before his father gets sick, you know. Pero I think Henry, he was such a good brother. I mean, I cried. But he was, you know, I mean, who but a big brother that loves you, even though he bothers you and he teases you and, he hits you over the head. But who else but a big brother would tell their family, Mom, Dad, I'm gay, and then 3 months later says, oh, I was just joking. So that way they're comfortable with the idea by the time Andres gets the courage to say, Mom and Dad, I'm gay. I'm really gay. This is not a joke. Henry stepped up, and Henry también, like a big brother's supposed to. He, when Andres has that opportunity to go off to college, to be different, to take a different path out of the I don't know what the good word would be, but out of out of staying in the same place and this. So he's the one who steps in and sort of discreetly talks to the boyfriend and says, let him go. So do you have a brother? Who is Henry based on? Because Henry is wonderful character. And I'm glad that he was able to have a wife and kids as his legacy. He left very good kids.
Thank you. Before I wrote this, I wasn't the sort of writer who felt anything for their characters. And I say that carefully because I've always wanted my characters to be three-dimensional and to have integrity and for people to relate to them. But I personally was able to draw a distinction between what I created and what was real. And I didn't have a lot of affection or emotion, where I would think about my characters. And then I wrote this book, and I feel that way about Simone and Henry, primarily the two characters in this book. I have several Henrys in my life, not brothers, but several Henrys in my life, people who are sort of fish out of water, and didn't succeed the first go around. And if you don't in this country, do everything exactly right the first time around, if you don't have a trust fund or some sort of safety net somewhere, then you end up sort of marked for life. And then you feel, and if you have all these expectations with you, in particular in this immigrant family was like education success, then you feel like a failure for the rest of your life, and you carry that with you. And so I know a few Henrys and people who there is always that sort of low level depression. There is never, no matter, even the good things happen, but they know it could have been better. And they didn't get that college degree, and they watch everyone sort of leave the place. And that's unfortunate, because I don't think you should have to sort of achieve some sort of educational or economic goal in this country or milestone in order to live with dignity. But we make it very difficult, for people to live with dignity unless they, and even if they do, unless they achieve the highest level of education or they have that super high paying job. I do have an older brother, and I have two younger sisters. And my brother, when I came out to him in college, said he saw how I was not doing well about it, if we're being honest. Actually, I've never talked about this. And he was worried about me, about my mental health and how I was going to deal. And he said, don't worry, I'll tell Mom and Dad I'm gay. And then once
Henry.
Yeah, and once they acclimate to it, then we'll just tell them we were kidding and it's you. And then they'll have gotten it out of their system. And I said, that's very nice of you, but please don't. And he didn't, but he was ready to do it. But that, of course, has always stayed with me. And I do have a great brother. And I thought, as I was writing this, that imagine if that had actually happened, and imagine. And that's sort of the fun I have with writing, is taking things that sort of happened or half happened or could have happened and then actually living them out on the page. But what Henry and my brother do have in common is that they're both great people. Yeah.
Yes, that really came across. I'll have to meet your brother. We don't have much time left. So we do want to ask that we know that you're working on a second novel, another one about public health. Tell us the name, tell us the premise, tell us when we can, get our little hands on it, and spill.
So it's a collection of short stories, and it's out.
Oh.
It's out April. I am working on a novel. That would be the third book. The collection of short stories comes out April 4th, and it is called The People Who Report More Stress. And it follows a series of narrators in the city. So if Babylon is about not being able to go home after you leave, then the people who report more stress is about what happens when you get someplace and you're uncomfortable there too. So you class jump, you achieve, and you still feel like a fish out of water. And so that is I believe there's 13 stories, 12 or 13 stories. We're sort of deciding if we're going to cut one or two. That's what those are about. And the third book, I don't have a title for it yet, but it's a little bit, I will say that I've been reading a lot of Jamaica Kincaid and Thomas Bernhardt, and I really would like to critique some of the liberalism that happens in blue cities and spaces and small government, local government. Particularly, I'm thinking of Brooklyn. And yeah, I'm gonna have a little fun with that. I hope to be done with that in the spring, and then we'll see what happens.
Good. Well, congratulations and good luck. And please
you.
keep us posted,
Thank you.
because
And
we
also-
love it.
Yeah, and if I may, I want to thank you very much for inviting me. This has been great, and Dahlma, your conversation was amazing, and I cannot wait to read your book.
Yes. Thank you. Comadre Karen?
Oh, okay. Am I
Oh, I'm
reading the-
sorry, Comadre Nora.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's Comadre Nora, right? It's my turn. Because I love to wrap these up, because I get so engrossed. It's like, oh my God, what happens next? And I fall in love. Every single time I fall in love. Dahlma, I fell in love with you again. Alejandro, it's my first time. But you know what? I'm waiting for the next time. I really am. Our thanks to authors Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa and Alejandro Varela, their publishers, Amistad Books and Astra Publishing House, and their generous donation of books to our early registrants. Thank you as well to our interviewers, Comadre Clara and Comadre Maria. Wow. Thank you so much for your insightful questions and your engagement with the authors. You really made it live for us. We thank our audience for taking the time to join us tonight. And to those that submitted questions, again, thank you. Again, our volunteers, without whom this book club and all the associated work would not happen. You all know how grateful we are. Mil gracias. Please remember to support our authors by writing a review of their books on sites like Amazon, Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, y los demás. These reviews carry weight with the publishers as well as with other readers. So what you write is extremely important. Buy books to support our authors. And if your library doesn't have one, ask them to order it because you want to read it and you want to tell others about it. And please remember to attend your virtual local book club meetings and bring a friend or two. And remember, our book club is open to men and women, Latinos, non-Latinos, all are welcome because we want you to learn about our culture through the writing of our authors. Our August books are In the Shadow of the Mountain, a memoir of courage by Silvia Vázquez Lavado, and A Caribbean Heiress in Paris by Adriana Herrera. Both of them sound fascinating and fun. Again, thank you all for your continued support of our book club and of Latino literature. Please join us in celebrating our quinceañero throughout the year by buying books and supporting Latino authors. Good night, and always read Latino Lit. Good night.
Night.